Take a deep breath. Know that you are loved. Take a deep breath. Know that you are loved. Breathe. You've arrived at the Evolving Lover podcast. This transmission is brought to you by the Online University of Love and Sexuality. We would love you to receive all of our podcasts and videos at www.uls.online. Now, take a deep breath. Know that you are loved. Take a deep breath. Know that you are loved. Breathe. You've arrived at the Evolving Lover podcast. This transmission is brought to you by the Online University of Love and Sexuality. We would love you to receive all of our podcasts and videos at www.uls.online. Now, here is your host, the funny, thoughtful, and loving Steve Burford. Enjoy.
Today we have slightly different guests to normal. We're going to be focusing on the power of voice. I'm with Stewart Pearce, who has been working with people's voices for much of his life, and he's also stepping into different realities with working with angels and all sorts of other things. I was intrigued to get him on when I saw a video of him with Teal Swan, who we did a first podcast with back in November, and I saw him speak in that, and really wanted to get him on and speak to him about the powered voice and his views on the world at large and how we can use our voice within relationship, and also his views on the new paradigm of relationship and where we are today. So hello to you, Stuart. It's great to have you here.
Hey, Steve. It's a great pleasure to be here. What an honor. And of course, the way that we met is not just through Teal, but you also coming along to an Angel Celebration Day about a month ago, I guess,
yeah,
to check out the angel scene and to find out what my credibility was all about. And then we fell into conversation, and as a result of that, here we are having this wonderful conversation online for your magazine. So thanks for inviting me.
It's an honor. Thank you very much for being here today. So let's start off with perhaps a bit more of an introduction into yourself. Tell us your story of what you've worked with, who you worked with in voice. I know you worked with the Shakespeare Company, the Globe, and this kind of things, and also to do with your other work and what you're up to at the moment. What's your mission?
Well, very much part of my life. I mean, for 40 years of my life, I was initially an actor, and the actor status, after about 8 or 9 years, transformed itself into, through very natural organic circumstances, transformed itself into my work as a voice coach, largely as a result of very big opportunities that came to me in the late 70s, early 80s, where I was able to make this transition between acting and voice coaching, as I was just saying. And as soon as I made that transition, many opportunities opened to me, one of which was working with Margaret Thatcher on her voice, and indeed becoming the head of voice of one of Britain's leading drama schools, which unfortunately no longer exists now, but was called the Webber Douglas Academy of Dramatic Art, that trained many extraordinary people like Stephen Burkhoff and Terence Stamp and Julia Ormond and Minnie Driver, Ross Kemp, Matthew Good, etc., etc., etc. So I had many young hopefuls through my hands, as it were, helping them to find a way of producing a harmony of sound that would be credible for them in their work as actors, with a very specific brief about classical theatre, and particularly about how to embrace the substance of Shakespeare or his contemporaries, and how that as a very powerful basis or foundation allows us to approach all the rhythmic structures of all the great writers, all the great playwrights that have actually arisen from the palette of Shakespeare, so to speak, all the way through to the present day, with some of the rather revolutionary writers that write today, both in TV, film, and indeed in theatre. That, of course, as usual, went through its own natural process of organic development. which meant that I started to gain a reputation for myself in the corporate industries of working as a presentation skills trainer, as a coach there. And that's been an extraordinary journey. But at the same time, I was meeting a great deal of people who were associated with their own specific branding. Actors such as Mark Rylance and Vanessa Redgrave, and oh gosh, and the list just goes on and on and on and on. And therefore, great opportunities arose. And one of them was that when Mark became the first artistic director of Shakespeare's Globe, he invited me to join the panel of experts that were drawn in or elicited to be part of the steering committee of that project, which effectively was to create a chamber of expertise where the words of Shakespeare could emit a very powerful message within the context of our contemporary lives. So in many ways, it was sort of taking ancient wisdom and making it palatable for modern daily life, because there are very powerful teachings about humanity within the plays. And so I did that very effectively for 10 or 12 years, which of course allowed me to become an ambassador for the project around the world. So I had great opportunities for my own public speaking skills to emerge and become bettered. But at the same time of doing all of this, I've always had a burgeoning intuitive consciousness. And so I developed that intuitive consciousness as a psychic and as a clairvoyant simply because that was apparent during my childhood, in the sense of the fact that I was always aware of the preternatural world, the metaphysical world, because spirit or ghosts or elemental energies would show themselves to me, angels would show themselves to me. I thought that everybody had this ability. As a child, I soon learned that it was not that case, in the sense of the fact that not everybody had the ability to see angels. They could see angels in stained glass windows or within books, but not the way that I was actually seeing them. So I sort of switched down as a kid. But as I began helping people and creatives with their voices, because our voices are really at the very core of our beings, and indeed, they have within the sound of our voice, there is a blueprint, which is very similar to the uniqueness of our fingerprint, or indeed to our DNA or blood print. And, I believe that that I just mentioned, that they're the categories that really allow us to promulgate our identity in the world, if that's something that we need to do. And over the last 27 years, I've been developing a whole process of sound healership, which is developing our own voices by understanding that we each have a note, and that when we open ourselves to that note, we find harmony within. And as a result of finding that harmony, we feel a sense of our own personal power, or as we would refer to in the more spiritual circles, we find the great I am presence, which is an esoteric code that's been used, since time immemorial, has been handed down, really, I suppose significantly since the great story of Moses asking God who he was or who she was, and God saying, I am that I am. And so the great I am presence has actually been utilized as a coda, as a way of being, as a form of teaching to elicit certain sensations within humanness, because we believe fundamentally that being human means that we're spiritual beings on a human journey, that we're being asked to draw our soul or spirit deeply into our flesh, and that many of us are part of this as a cosmic experiment to find out what this level of life existence is all about on this very extraordinary planet. So you can hear from my commentary that I sort of balance a number of rather principal objectives in my life. I suppose initially it's all about sound healership, and how in 1987 I received a divine transmission of meeting 12 angels in one of the Earth's leading energy centers, namely Glastonbury Tor. And that these angels proclaim themselves to be the angels of Atlantis. They come together as a collective for this time. They are historically a movement of angelic activity, or a communion of activity that has really affected planet Earth through great pockets of history. But indeed they come at this time because by coming at this time, as we go through this extraordinary change, as we move through the middle of this spiritual vortex, their information, their loving embrace can help us as individuals to proclaim our own particular sovereignty in the world. So there are many different things that I utilize to balance, but principally it's about, are we being the authentic people that we are? Are we healing on all levels of experience, physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually, so that all of our relationships are conducted with the greatest love, the greatest harmony, the greatest discernment, and the greatest ease or flow that we can muster in these bodies that we call human?
Thank you for that introduction. Yeah, and I think just the first question should perhaps be about this tool that we have that is our voices, and to bring us in alignment. For the listeners, how can we perhaps use our voice better, or just be more aware? What is some of the awareness we can have around our voice when we're using it in intimate conversations especially?
It's intriguing, isn't it? Because the question has a history about it, which I find very intriguing, but a history that it seems many people are not necessarily fully aware of. And what I'm referring to is the fact that I can remember when I was born, when I was growing, that there was a constant reference to the way that we spoke, that people were very aware of the way that they spoke, because when we spoke, our voices proclaimed who we were in the world and therefore ratified us in terms of which society we were associated with. Now, the challenge with that, of course, is that there was a tremendous amount of snobbery and a tremendous amount of personal preoccupation and predilection, which was very political. And so it was considered that the only way to be a rightful person in society was if you sounded rather like I sound, which is a dialect which is known now as received pronunciation, which is a standard dialect that was taught when I was a kid, and certainly it was something that I was asked to teach actors, so that if actors arose from dialect situations, such as, for example, an actor that came from Liverpool and spoke with a Liverpool accent, it was all like that, that the individual would find that in terms of their casting as an actor, that they would only end up speaking with a Liverpool accent, which of course would be extremely restrictive, or a huge restriction to the possibility of what their creative expertise was all about. And so actors were always taught an RPE dialect so that they could actually move through all genres and all styles and forms of theatre. That is less the case today. It seems that we're not really interested in the sound of our voices today. And in this city particularly, it seems that the sound that needs to be made is a sound that goes a bit like that, which is called Estuary English, which has really come out of the conurbated communities, like, during the Second World War, when the East End of London was being bombed, because that's where a lot of industrial activity, so Hitler's bombers bombed. A lot of the people who were living there, i.e. the Cockneys or the East Enders who talked like that, were moved to both Essex and to Kent. And so we have this hybrid accent, which is called Estuary English, because it principally arises out of the mouth of the estuary of the River Thames, from the north part of Essex and the south part of Kent. So, Essex, it's sort of a bit like that. It sort of goes slightly nasal, and it's all a bit sibilant sometimes, so it gets a bit splashy. And then when you go down south, it goes right down there like that, into sort of Rochester and Dover and places like that. But it's all like, it's sort of, you can hear there are very few final consonants.
What about America?
And the interesting thing about the growth of the American sound is the fact that it's increasingly become more nasal over the last 30 years. And so whereas you would hear, good afternoon, I'm from New York City, would you please come this way? You hear now, good afternoon, would you like to come this way? It's getting really, really, really nasal up there like that. And there's a tremendous amount of tension, as you can hear, through the whole of the throat mechanism that produces that sound. And it's produced by squidging the back of the tongue right up against the roof of the mouth. And it seems to me that one of the reasons why that's happening is because we're moving very, very fast in our speech, that we're being encouraged to think and speak in sound bites. So the breath is sorely affected because we're needing to move really fast. Very few people breathe deeply. And as a result of that, we're beginning to think in much shorter thoughts, because the interesting thing about our breath is that whatever language we speak, we always have enough breath for the thoughts that we speak. It's just that today we're using very, very short thoughts in comparison with the writing or indeed the speaking that came through, say, 100 years ago or 200 years ago. How do I know this? Well, all we need to do is to look into literature, and we can begin to see that sentence construction was much longer 100 years ago, and much longer still 200 years ago, and much longer still 300 or 400 years ago. And this was something that became particularly apparent to me when I was working with young actors at Shakespeare's Globe Theatre, who were there because they were talented, and they were there often because they'd established a certain position of might or fame within the industry, and therefore they would draw audiences a lot. But at the same time that they hadn't approached Shakespeare for a number of years, and so it was my job to actually help them understand how they could speak the lines of Shakespeare with the greatest ease, with the greatest flow, and with the greatest authenticity. Because we each have a note, you see, wherever we're going with the speech aspect of our voices. We each have a note, and that note comes from the very core of our beings. The difficulty is that many of us don't sound that note today because we're very preoccupied with that we've been taught and socialized to do, which is to produce a very cerebral sound. And so, in other words, what many of us do is to talk here. So, it's quite head-bound. It's cerebral resonance. It has that slight nasality about it. It's quite thrusting as I go. And you can hear that it doesn't really have any of the warm emotional resonance that I was hopefully communicating with just now. So I'm going to change this because, this sound is not something that I feel is really the truth of me. And what I'm going to do is go back down into this part of my body where I feel the warmth of the emotional center pouring through my sound. And you hear that what I've done is I've moved into a place of great ease and a place of great flow. And also you can hear with this sound that there's a certain gravitas or authority, a weight at least, that's attached to it. It feels as though I'm communicating much more of my heart than if I go here.
Yeah, definitely. And how might someone, is it just about having that awareness of where your voice comes from? What steps could we make to step into a more fully rounded, embodied voice?
Well, it's by working very simply with the notion of finding one's note, the song of one's soul. And as I've just indicated, it's not a sound that principally comes from the head, it comes from the body. So it's a question of finding a locus or a center within our bodies that is, as it were, the orifice through which we speak. And what I'm suggesting here is that it's our heart. Because, for example, one of the pieces of proverb that moves through me so keenly, and I believe it's by Hafid, the great Persian poet and and philosopher rather. And the statement is, if words arise from the heart, they will enter the heart. If words arise from the tongue alone, they will not pass beyond the ears. Which is an interesting adage to suggest to some of our politicians or corporate chiefs of today. So the sound comes right out of the sternum, not by pushing the voice down, of course, because otherwise we just feel as though we're really, really underpitching the voice, but by really feeling how the breath centers itself through the middle of the voice. And this one needs to really work with a trainer because there's a great deal of confusion about the way that we breathe today. The predominant focus on breath is that we just breathe into the abdomen, which is fine if we're in a state of rest, but I believe that what we're really talking about is the way that we are active in the establishment of our relationships in the world, not just simply being very passive, which associates itself with the yielding and the surrendering of the divine feminine, but of moving into a balance between the active and the passive. So there is a feeling of freeness, there is a feeling of relaxation in the body, which is found through very, very deep breathing. But then how we find the way that the breath begins to function through our voices, it needs a little bit more than just the abdominal breath. Otherwise, breath is very short-lived, and the voice can often take on the individual voice can take on a lot of tension. But if we're actually breathing wide through the rib cage and then deep within the body, the vocal mechanism I've discovered is very free and buoyant. So there is maximum resonation. because maximum resonation comes from a fluidity between the chest, the throat, the mouth, and indeed the bone structure of the head. Does that make sense?
Sounds very interesting. And to further step perhaps into your other types of work and your views on where we are with our current state of relationships between men and women, and also men and men and women, where do you see where we are at the moment and where we're going? Because everything seems to be making a shift right now.
Yeah, I feel it's very exciting, although it's immensely explosive. Exciting because it seems that the whole substance of the way that we conduct our relationships is being placed under tremendous scrutiny, largely as a result of the fact that many people feel that their relationships per se, whether they be personal or professional, are in need of re-innovation, sometimes through a point of completion or a point of closure, which always worries us deeply, because I guess our relationships are some of the most complex structures in our lives and the maintenance of our relationships. So if there's a changing face within the structure of the way that we relate to people, particularly if long-term relationships, both personally and professionally, are coming to closure, that we always feel somewhat threatened. And so I find this very exciting, not that we're threatened, but I find it exciting that we're moving into understanding more comprehensively what our relationships are all about and the way that we make choices about the quality of relationship that we want to live. What I'm particularly referring to is this relationship lived through codependency, and therefore I use it as a safety mechanism to simply bolster a very uncertain sense of self? Or am I really living through the co-creative aspect of this relationship, which helps me grow as an individual? And because my love is so intense for other, it allows the unconditional aspect of my love to shine light into other, the significant other, that allows them to grow at the same time.
Touching on the co-creation and stepping away from codependence, I think that's one of the main themes of the magazine and our podcasts is, how we step away from drama and go into this limitless realm within a relationship. Maybe you could speak about your ideas of like the potential of a relationship. What is available to us within a relationship, especially when it comes to this co-creation thing? If you could imagine some almost divine relationship, what might it look like to you?
This transmission is brought to you by the Online University of Love and Sexuality. We would love you to receive all of our podcasts and videos at www.uls.online.
Well, it's a very interesting question because I have lots of intimate relationships with friends, but for some considerable amount of time I've chosen to live alone, to explore, and that is without a sexual partner, without a loving partner on a very, very intimate level, such as, the most intimate aspects of our relationship processes. And so, I'm now looking to move back into relationship. I believe that relationship is something that we can manifest as part of our creative destiny, and that what we're beginning to understand more and more are the vital substances that flow out of the great field of thought to do with the law of attraction, that actually thought creates reality, and feeling brings about the manifestation of that thought. The main thing is to keep the main thing, and then we manifest in 3D through the anticipations, not the expectations of our desire, the aspect that we wish to create. So indeed, on a personal level, I'm coming back into manifesting a significant partner. So to reach into the thrust of your question, it feels to me that what we're looking for in these new paradigm relationships is something that hasn't been in the post-paradigm of these new structures, these neo-structures, and that is an element of complete transparency, where we're sharing ourselves on a very honest level rather than hiding essential aspects of ourselves because we feel that they would be in judgment of us or that we would be in division on some level. And so we hold back vital parts of us. And of course, what I'm talking about is not just simply the way that we perceive the love of that relationship, but the way that we actually perceive the entire quantity of our lives and the way that we wish to bring in vital quality decisions into the quantity of our lives, the way that we live them independently and the way that we live them co-creatively. And so that level of transparency seems to me to be one of the major tools that are being afforded by these great changes that we're moving through at this moment.
Mm. And so this, in terms of the tools that we can use, is one is being transparent to take us towards this limitless co-creation, new paradigm that you talk about.
Well, you see, to go back to the beginning of our conversation when you were asking about my voice, my work with voice, if we find our note, we find a quality of harmony within our beings that is truly joyous. So we recognize that we are from the source, and the source is an infinitely unfolding creative possibility full of love and joy. So it brings us back into harmony. It brings us back into the enchantment of our lives. There is joy present rather than the disenchantments that we see in so many people's lives, or indeed, within aspects of our societies. There's so much disenchantment as a result of the belief system that there's not enough. There's not enough love, there's not enough welfare, there's not enough money, there are not enough jobs, there are not enough. And it seems to me that we become so preoccupied with this aspect of scarcity that we're not seeing that the world is full of abundance, and that indeed our lives can be full of abundance if we move ourselves back into harmony. So once we move back into this harmony and we find our note, we find our power, and so we find the I am presence. Now this is a huge resonance, which automatically starts bringing magic and miracle to us, because as soon as we reflect this quality of being in the world, we draw to us people and situations that are ultimately in harmony with what we are feeling and creating. That's the way of the world, that whatever we are feeling, we create in the space beyond us, that life is not happening to us, it's responding to us. So we become literally co-creative in the substance of the way that we live and the manifestation of our ideas and our desires and passions. As we draw intimate other into our lives, there is naturally, because they're seemingly engaged in the same activity, because they come in on the slipstream of our own creative magnetic resonance within what Rupert Sheldrake calls the morphogenetic field. That there is a field of consciousness that is responding constantly to the flow of what quantum physics is all about, or what the universe and what the galaxy is all about. So automatically we bring in people who are very intelligent, meaning they are aware because they've asked questions, not as intellectuals, but purely as thinking beings, that they ask questions and they found answers to those questions. So it opens up a very interesting conversation about how we can share our lives together in the openness of the furtherance of our creativity, that we feel is individually important and that we feel is co-creatively or mutually important within the mutual respect of each other. And it seems to me that one of the greatest joys, because fundamentally this is all about what are you feeling? Are you feeling good? Are you feeling bad? And most of us, it seems, most of the time feel bad rather than feeling good. And if we're sharing with somebody on a very, very intimate level, it seems to me that as we begin to co-create on the levels that I've been describing, and I'm just talking about them in a very sketchy form because our relationships are so complex, but if we're sharing together, we move into a really ecstatic embrace of each other's energies. It's that wonderful feeling of moving through life with someone where you share the same rhythm. Within the experience of our own individual rhythms, whether it be our the pulse of our heart or the rhythm of our breath, that when we move into lovemaking, we often breathe together. And this is what brings us together. So it actually formulates a very divine synergy where pranayama is exchanged. And it seems to me that that's one of the greatest joys of our lives, that in our individuality and in our seeming separateness, we come together and we feel a very rich empathy or synergy being exchanged. And that, for me, is one of the essential aspects of the crucible of life that I constantly seek. I could say that, for example, I've spent the last 60-odd years wandering around this planet looking for people with their hearts open, because I feel that when people have opened their hearts, there is a degree of honesty that is being, as it were, resonated from their being. But love is one of the key features of that, because love is all there is, fundamentally. We think there are other things, and so we tend to construct them, but actually love is all there is when we come right down to the final moment of the final choice, which is, shall I cease my breathing or shall I pass into that experience which we call death, which I believe is a point of completion and a point of beginning. So yes, so our voices, I feel, through our breath, is right at the very core of the way that we establish transparency and co-creative honesty as we move forward. Now, what this requires, it requires a great deal of bravery, I believe, and a great deal of courage of being able to say to those people who are significant of us, I love you, and I love you very intensely, and what this means to me is this. Or when misbehavior is committed, that we have the ability to do something I'm calling infronting, not confronting, because confronting always suggests aggression, whereas infronting is that we step forward in the bewildering nature of our own truth, knowing full well that it's only our perception that we're communicating, and say, I just need to bring to your attention the fact that what I've just observed in your behavior is really in disharmony with the way that I believe my life is conducted on this planet. And may we bring about a resorting of these energies? May we bring about together, or are you willing to change that behavior? And it seems to me that many people lack the courage of being able to do this, of moving forward in true transparency.
I think that's the most eloquent way I could ever imagine someone confronting a difficulty within a relationship with their partner. I'll have to note that one down for myself. I think I was quite good at communicating, but you can always improve, and that sounds like a very harmonious way to communicate to your partner, which is incredibly important when it comes to a relationship. Communication is the heartbeat of the dance, and it's your voice, like you mentioned, and the words that you use to help create the dance.
I hear you. I feel that this is fundamental. Yes, I feel it. I feel it in the very core of my being. These words that I choose are simply words that express feeling, because that's where I arise from. I feel that feeling is the language of the soul, and what we're developing is a very new language or linguistic about the way that we feel and what we feel about our personal relationships. Too many of us are terrified about speaking our truth, about what we feel, in case we hurt other. The number one statement that's made to me when it's obvious that a relationship has reached its sell-by date, so to speak, that the individual who is feeling this is frightened about speaking to their partner because they don't want to hurt them. And it's very difficult to persuade somebody that statement itself is tantamount to dishonesty, and that the only way that that individual could be hurt is through a dishonesty, through a breaking of trust, through a breaking of faith. And that's fundamentally what they're committing themselves to, that they're being faithless rather than faithful. And one of the greatest love mechanisms is to be able to move forward and say, I want you to hear that the reason why this relationship is finishing is because of me, not because of you. It's not anything that you've done. It's just that I've reached a point where I need to move on to find other aspects of myself, because what I see without is a reflection of what's going on within. And this is no longer working for me. Can you hold me in this? I mean, that was one of the greatest tests that I remember being taken through a number of years ago when I had to unfortunately finalize a relationship that was existing over a period of 5 or 6 years, and then it reached a point of completion, not for me, but for my partner, that in order to literally promulgate my love in celebration of what my love force is, that it is unconditional, it's not conditional, I had to let them go. And that was really, really painful on the lower level of my being. In terms of my higher self, it was one of the greatest victories that I've achieved, because it meant that my loving could just go on and on and on and on without being an attachment to the object of my desire. And wow, was it desirous?
The unconditional love piece is one we all need to take on as well.
I feel it's the only way forward, do you see? It's the only way forward. There are many abstractions or extrapolations of unconditional love, but it's the only way forward. When we look at the bubbling horror of what's taking place in the Middle East, the strife in the Middle East is purely and simply based on the conditions of tribal love. You should do this, you must do this, you ought to do this, it is your obligation and your duty to do this, and if you don't do this, you will no longer be my son, or you will no longer be my daughter. I'm throwing you out, now I'm disinheriting you. I mean, that's what these tribal warfares, as I call them, is what the great horror of the melting pot of conflict and strife and disharmony between the Palestinian and the Jewish people is all about. It's very simple. One of the relationships that I lived in for about 13 years was actually in marriage to an Israeli. So I was actually able to see the whole substance from very, very close quarters, and was very surprised to discover that right at the very core of the conflict is the distortions of conditional love. Yeah. And of course, all that I say with as much unconditional love as I can. None of what I say is intended as a judgment. It is intended as a discernment. And I feel that in the sweeping changes that are taking place in our relationships today, that we need to really define, is this action that I'm perpetrating to my dear one, is this a judgment, or is this me being discerning? Because fundamentally, it's all a perception. The question is the perception worthy, or is it unworthy? If it's manipulative, then it's completely unworthy. It's dishonest. But if it's engineering a greater truth for self and for other and for self, and therefore to create a harmony that is one of the most powerful distributions of our energy in the world through the resonance of that harmony, because we're learning through heart math that the heart has an energy field 5,000 times greater than the human brain. So if we're working with intimate other in significant flows of honesty and discernment, it means that our heart vibration gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Well, if the individual heart is 5,000 times greater than the brain, just imagine what it's like in a co-creative relationship when two hearts come together and mirror one another, not in duplicity, but through absolute honesty. That means that the energy field of those two people is going to be so broad, it's going to manifest other energy fields around that are in like suit or in like resonance from a synergistic point of view. And I think that's what the fundament of our personal relationships are all about. They got great charges in the world that produce sympathetic magic. I feel we know this because we always look at great partnerships and we're in awe of them, because the love seems so tangible. It's almost as though you can hold the love.
I totally agree. And I think we can end the podcast there. Perhaps we can maybe sum up, for me, what you've said today. One of the key messages is the awareness of the voice and the tools to use within our relationships, such as this transparency, this awareness, and this conscious communication can enable us to open our hearts and create this resonance with each other. And when our hearts are fully open and beating as one and breathing together as one, we can create these powerful partnerships. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, yes, out of loyalty. which isn't necessarily fully germane with our conversation today, but is an expansion of our conversation. And the way that I would approach it is firstly to do with the fact that I love your synthesis. I feel that fundamentally what we're talking about is how we're learning to love, and that we're moving away from the unconscious forms of our loving processes, that we're purely and simply enraptured by the very tight and seemingly diverse aspects of the way that we were trying to commit ourselves to permanency and this thing that we call security. And then when we become very free in our loving, we begin to realize that there is more in this world, Horatio, than you dreamed of. And we begin to realize that our loving and co-creativity is not just for intimate other, but it actually spreads into the extension of the animal, vegetable, and mineral kingdom. So we become aware of the fact that we're living on a planet of such beauty that we love the planet. And therefore, I'm taking us in this direction because it seems to me that there's a non-corporeal intelligence about the way that we live our lives in our loving. And this is where I reach for these extraordinary beings that are the messengers of God, that teach us fundamentally about our loving, and these being the angels that are available to us, because they teach us that human beings love for the sake of loving. Human beings love for the sake of being loved. Whereas angels, in their unconditionality, love for the sake of loving alone. There is nothing in return that they wish. They will not actually work for us unless we ask. We have to ask, even though we have a guardian angel that is with us from our inception to our leaving when we move back into source. And so, in this moment of finality, I just sort of bow to the greater wisdom of these angels and how they are teaching us at this time. And if anybody listening to this podcast is interested in the quality of this conversation that Steve and I are having, the contribution that I make to our lives, apart from what I'm saying, is through two great orifices on cyberspace. One is called the alchemyofvoice.com, and the other is called the angelsofatlantis.com, where a tremendous amount of information can be found of angelic sound healing and how they're beginning to speak to us in very supernatural ways. Because it's palpably obvious that the next level of our expansion on this planet is by utilizing magic and miracles. I was working with a client of mine in New York City last week who happens to be one of the great spokespeople at the UN. And she said to me, have you ever been into the UN chamber? Which I hadn't. And so I said, no, I haven't. So she said, well, why don't we go in? Because we were actually in the building. So we went into the great chamber of the UN, where some of the most crucial debates take place. And the debate that was taking place was the usual debate about the fact that the ecology of our planet is unloved, the ecology of our planet is unrelatable to, the ecology of our planet is poisoned, and that actually, nihilistically, all that's happening is that we're moving towards the edge of doom, and we're all going to fall off the precipice, which is the most ghastly thing to hear and think about. But there were many intelligent people, and then suddenly this beautiful Pakistani lady stood up and threw her arms in the air and said, there is nothing new in what I'm hearing here. This is a very old conversation that we're just simply being taken forward to these nihilistic tendencies. And it seems to me that now is the time for magic and miracles. And then spent 10 minutes talking about miracles. So it seems to me that, just to add an absolute finality to our conversation, that as we move forward in our personal relationships to find out what is truly loving, and how we live out that loving through transparency and honesty, suddenly that love becomes a miraculous adventure by which we can live our lives and become the totality of what we are all about as we gestate and evolve at this time. And so thank you, Steve, for giving me the opportunity to share some of these feelings and thoughts with you.
And thank you for your time in doing so. Very much appreciated. And I think your websites again, if you want to just remind people.
www.thealchemyofvoice.com and www.theangelsofatlantis.com.
This transmission is brought to you by the Online University of Love and Sexuality. We would love you to receive all of our podcasts and videos at www.uls.online.